On November 25, 2022, the Brazilian Army selected the B2 Centauro as their new fire support vehicle under the VBC CAV program. This marks a new milestone for the Brazilian Army, as it will not only operate fire support vehicles for the very first time, but also mark a significant step towards a modern Brazilian Army. The Brazilian Army currently plans to acquire 98 B2s, of which 78 are to be assembled locally, in order to replace their current fleet of EE-9 Cascavels. Welcome to Tank Encyclopedia. I'm Alcazar. If you like what we do and want to see more of it, don't forget to like the video, and if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss a single upload. The VBC CAV is part of the large-scale overarching Nova Couraça modernization program of the Brazilian Army, which will end around 2040. Although the VBC CAV project was first conceived in 2007, the history of the program goes much further, all the way back to the mid-1970s and the dawn of the Brazilian defense industry. Brazil's first experience with an FSV was with the EE-17 Sucuri. The Brazilian company Engesa, which would later build the Osório MBT, built a wheeled 6x6 anti-tank vehicle for the export market in the mid-1970s. They seemingly wanted a piece of the market after seeing the French AMX-10RC, which was designed with a similar concept in mind. The EE-17 was, for all intents and purposes, not much more than a lengthened EE-11 Urutu APC hull with a 105mm armed AMX-13 turret slapped on top. It seems that the piece of cake Engesa tried to get was gone or never there to begin with, as they didn't manage to sell the vehicle. About 10 years later, with the conception of the Italian B1 Centauro, Engesa again wanted in on the action. This time, they took it more seriously and designed a purpose-built hull and co-developed a turret with the Centauro designers from Otto Malata. The new vehicle, known as the EE-18 Sucuri, besides sharing its name, concept, and eventual fate, had nothing in common with the EE-17. The EE-18 used the same gun as the B1 Centauro, but on a 6x6 platform. The first and only prototype was built in 1987, but the market seems to have again not been in Engesa's favor, as the EE-18 also didn't manage to attract any customers. About 6 years later, Engesa went bankrupt due to a multitude of reasons. A financial crisis which started in the early to mid-1980s and lasted until about 1995 would bankrupt companies and Army projects alike, gutting the national armored vehicle industry. The Brazilian Army simply didn't have the money nor a seemingly good idea about what to do with these types of vehicles. To solve this problem, and to get an idea of what these modern vehicles could do, the Brazilians again returned to the Italians. This will essentially be a recurring theme from the EE-18 on, as the Brazilians and Italians became BFFs over their mutual fanboyism for wheeled armored fighting vehicles. The Brazilian Army tested the B1 Centauro from April to July 2001 as part of a program to look into possibly replacing the old EE-9 Cascavels. Brazil had bought the EE-9 from Engesa in the late 1970s and during the 1980s, and it still forms the backbone of Brazil's current wheeled vehicle fleet. Although seemingly impressed by the B1 Centauro, the Brazilian Army abstained from buying any EE-9 replacements at the time, a decision which would return to haunt them down the line. The first reasonable step towards Brazil actually obtaining an FSV was taken when the Italian company Iveco signed the contract to develop and build the 6x6 Guarani APC in 2007. The Guarani APC was intertwined with the FSV project, as the overarching program had already considered a potential 8x8 platform as early as 2000 to operate alongside the 6x6. The first concept of an FSV was presented at the 2007 LAD Defense Expo. The concept sketch showed a lengthened version of the standard 6x6 Guarani design, armed with a 105mm gun. But the FSV program would have to understandably wait for the basic Guarani to get off the ground first in 2010. 4 years later, the time had finally come to make some real steps, as the Brazilian Army put forward a request for information on the armament of fire support vehicles. This resulted in proposals from the two main rivals in this program, Cockerill and Automalata. In April 2015, Cockerill proposed its 3105 turret at the LAD Expo, painted in a Brazilian color scheme, while Automalata proposed its HitFact 2 turret in the same year. The HitFact 2 turret was proposed for a potential Guarani 8x8 and offered to be mostly locally produced. These two proposals were the opening salvos of a back and forth between Cockerill and Automalata, of which the latter would be represented by its parent company, Leonardo, in future endeavors. However, the Brazilian Army had to wait, as the project would be shelved in 2017 due to lack of funds. 2 years later, though, the Army received enough money to not only restart the FSV program, but essentially undertake the largest modernization program in decades. This program, known as Nova Couraça, seeks to modernize the entire ground vehicle fleet of the Brazilian Army. This includes the EE-9 and Leopard 1A5 modernization programs, but also projects for a new MBT, AFV, and self-propelled artillery pieces. The program kicked off by having talks with companies like BAE Systems, KMW, Iveco, and Equitron, each company bringing in expertise and possible products for the program. The Brazilian Army presented requirements for the future VBC CAV in 2020. From this point on, all gears of the VBC plan would be set in motion. However, the past failures to acquire a new vehicle would come back to haunt the Brazilian Army. A year after having released the 8x8 requirements, the Brazilian Army released the expected timetable for the acquisition as well. This came with a bit of a problem. The Army expected to receive its final 98th vehicle in 2038. This meant that the Brazilian mechanized cavalry regiments would have to keep on operating their already 35 to 40-year-old EE-9 Cascavels for another 20 years at least. This dated platform, combined with the fact that the Brazilian Army had purchased essentially the most bare-bones version one could buy, meant that it was forced to modernize the EE-9s as a stopgap. This decision, caused by inability to acquire equipment previously, naturally came with some controversy. However, the modernization of the EE-9 was a necessary evil to cover the FSV's production schedule. 98 EE-9s are to be modernized with the installation of thermals, improved fire controls, a new engine, and 30% are to be armed with ATGMs. With the release of the requirements in 2020, speculation went wild on which companies would make a bid for the VBC CAV contract. Essentially, every 105 or 120 millimeter armed 8x8 was put forward, from the German Arctech Boxer to the Finnish Patria AMV XP. But two proposals would come to the forefront: the purpose-built Italian B2 Centauro and the GDLS LAV 700. These two competitors also brought back the previous turret Rivalry. The B2 came with the HitFact 2 from Leonardo, and the LAV 700 with the Cockerill 3105, both of which had been previously proposed in 2015. This rivalry rekindled at the 2022 Eurosatory Expo, where Cockerill presented a modernized Leopard 1 armed with the 3105 turret. In a matter of days, Leonardo came forward with a design sketch of a HitFact 2 turret mated on top of the Leopard 1 as well. Considering Brazil plans to modernize its Leopard 1A5s, these proposals do not seem to have originated by accident either. Their likely importance as factors for the VBC CAV program only seem to have increased when the Brazilian Army revised their Leopard modernization requirements a few months later. In September 2022, the Brazilian Army decreased the number of Leopards to be modernized from 116 to 52 vehicles, but also added the possibility to rearm the modernized Leopard with a 120mm gun instead of what was originally just meant as an overhaul. Revised requirements were put forward by the Brazilian Army for the VBC CAV in 2022, and the beginning of the acquisition process was announced in July that year. 6 companies attempted to secure the contract, of which 3 were officially rejected in early October. These projects were the Israeli Eitan, the Indian Kestrel, and finally the Wahash from the United Arab Emirates. Supposedly, the main reason for their rejection was that they were either part of pilot lots or not ordered or even built at all. This left the project with 3 vehicles, the previously mentioned B2 and LAV 700, and the Chinese ST-1BR from Norinco. Each of these vehicles came with their own set of advantages. The ST-1BR was fully customized by Norinco to match Brazil's demands and was the only amphibious vehicle of the 3. China also had political leverage through BRICS, of which Brazil and China are both members. The LAV 700 mainly had the advantage that Brazil was designated by the United States as a major non-NATO ally, with the possibility of opening doors for more co-development with the United States, but also access to depleted uranium ammunition. In addition, the Cockerel 3105 Armed Leopard 1 prototype also had to be taken into account. But all these advantages of the ST-1BR and the LAV 700 pale in comparison to Italy's gigantic foot, or more fittingly, wheel in the door. Not only was the B2 Centauro the only purpose-built vehicle, it also brought the 120mm gun. This is on top of the possibility of making design changes to the Brazilian version of the B2 to allow for as much interchangeability with Iveco's Guarani already in service. Brazil had a total of 186 4x4 Linces and a total of 1,580 Guaranis on order from the Italian defense industry as well. Considering the 15-year-long working relationship between the Brazilian army and the Italian defense industry, one could argue that Italy already secured the contract in 2007 when it got the Guarani contract. So it was after talks in mid-October that the Brazilian army announced on November 25, 2022, that it would acquire 98 B2 Centauros. This deal comes with a technology transfer deal and the eventual assembly of 78 B2s in Brazil. 8 vehicles are to be acquired between 2022 and 2024, as testing prototypes and local assembly should begin in 2027. The acquisition marks the first significant step of the Brazilian Army in its modernization attempts, and more is yet to come. This concludes a history of Brazil's VBC CAV program and the acquisition of the B2 Centauro. If you aren't already, consider becoming a subscriber so you don't miss a single video. If you want to contribute more directly, consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. The money comes back to you in the form of bigger and better videos. Until next time, keep us in your sights.